I'm Alina, I'm 42, and the woman who married my father for his money, adopted me to secure her claim, and spent 20 years trying to erase my mother's memory became my legal ward when dementia took her mind, and I held the power she'd spent decades cultivating. This is a story about inheritance, not the money kind, though there's plenty of that. The kind you choose. The family you construct from the wreckage of the family you were given. And the strange, cold satisfaction of becoming the parent to the parent who never parented you. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories, where we tell quiet stories about families, about the power we seize and the power we surrender, and about the strength it takes to care for someone who never cared for you. If a story ever made you feel less alone, that's why we're here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's walk through this one together. Here's my story. The first time I understood that Margot had calculated my value, I was 9 years old. It was 6 months after my father's wedding, a small ceremony at the country club where Margot's family had memberships and my mother's family had never been invited. I was standing in the kitchen of our house, the house my mother had chosen, decorated, filled with the evidence of her existence, watching Margot open a box of photographs. My mother's photographs. The wedding album, honeymoon snapshots, the hospital pictures from my birth, the birthday parties and beach trips and Christmas mornings that documented the first 7 years of my life. Margot went through them methodically, not looking at the images, just sorting, some into a box labeled storage. Others, the ones with my father prominent, into a box labeled display. And a third pile, the ones where my mother appeared alone or with me, into the trash. Those are my mommy's pictures. I said, the protest small in my throat, the way children speak when they know they're challenging something larger than themselves. Margot didn't look up. I'm your mommy now, Alina. Legally. Your father signed the papers yesterday, and we don't need to clutter the house with old memories when we're making new ones. She said it with the efficiency that defined everything she did, the way she organized closets, scheduled appointments, managed my father's practice. No cruelty, no raised voice. Just the calm certainty of someone who had determined the correct order of things and was implementing it without emotional interference. I didn't argue. I was 9, and I'd learned already that my father didn't contradict Margot, that the house ran on her schedule, that my mother's absence was a subject he avoided with the same determination he applied to his golf game. I watched her throw away the photographs, and I memorized the ones I could see, my mother holding me at 2, both of us laughing at something off camera. My mother at the beach, her hair dark and wet, her smile the open, unguarded expression I'd never seen on Margot's face. That night I retrieved what I could from the trash. 3 photographs, wrinkled, stained with coffee grounds, but intact. I hid them in the space between my mattress and box spring, the first of many hiding places I'd create over the years. Margot never noticed. She didn't notice much about me, as long as I was clean, polite, and absent from spaces where she entertained. I was furniture, inherited with the house, to be maintained but not engaged with. She spoke to me about schedules, school, activities, meals, and occasionally about gratitude. Your father and I have given you so much, she'd say, whenever I asked about my mother, whenever I mentioned the past, whenever I expressed needs that didn't fit her plans. You should be grateful. I learned to be grateful, learned to perform gratitude the way I performed everything else, the good student, the polite daughter, the child who didn't make scenes at dinner parties or ask inconvenient questions about where her mother's jewelry had gone. Margot wore my mother's pearls now, the ones my father had given my mother on their 10th anniversary. She wore them to church, to the club, to the hospital benefits where she networked with other doctors' wives. Family heirlooms, she'd say when complimented, never mentioning which family, never acknowledging that the original owner had died in the bedroom down the hall. My father saw none of this, or saw it and chose not to interpret it. He was a man who had loved my mother, I believe, in the limited way he was capable of love, as a presence that made his life comfortable, a partner who managed his domestic world while he managed his professional one. When she died, that presence ended, and he needed a replacement with the same efficiency he applied to hiring office staff. Margot was the replacement. Younger, more attractive, more socially ambitious, and willing to take on the package deal that included a grieving child. He died when I was 26. Heart attack, sudden, the kind that kills men who have spent their lives avoiding emotional confrontation. I was in my 2nd year of nursing school, living in an apartment near the university, working weekends at a hospital to cover tuition. Margot called me, her voice carrying the same efficiency she applied to everything. Your father passed. Funeral Saturday, wear black, and hung up before I could respond. I arrived at the house to find it transformed. My mother's furniture, what little Margot hadn't discarded, was gone. The walls were repainted in colors Margot preferred. My father's study, where he'd kept my mother's photograph on his desk, was now a home gym with Margot's exercise equipment and a mirror that reflected only her. "Where are his things?" I asked, standing in the doorway of the study, the absence of my father's presence hitting me like a physical blow. "Stored," Margot said, emerging from the kitchen with a glass of wine, the color of mourning already replaced by the efficiency of transition. "Or donated, he didn't need them anymore and I need to move forward." "His desk, the photograph, Elena." She set down the wine, her voice carrying the note of patience that was really impatience, the tone of someone dealing with a slow child. "Your father is gone. I'm your mother now, legally, and I need you to start thinking about the future rather than dwelling on the past. I've arranged a gift for you, $50,000. Enough to finish your nursing degree and start your life. But the estate, the house, the investments, those are mine. Your father made sure of that." She smiled, the expression that had always frightened me more than any anger, the smile of someone who had won completely and was now gracious in victory. "You should be grateful," she said. "Many stepchildren receive nothing." I was grateful, or performed gratitude, the way I'd been trained. I took the check, finished my degree, moved to another city, built a career that kept me busy enough to avoid thinking about what I'd lost. I told myself that $50,000 was generous, that Margot had no obligation to me, that my father's choices were his own and not her fault. But I watched her. From a distance, through mutual acquaintances, through the occasional holiday call that was more obligation than connection. I watched her age, watched her social circle shrink, watched her efficiency become brittleness as the world changed around her. And I watched myself, learning geriatric care not just as a profession, but as a study, understanding the vulnerabilities of aging, the systems that controlled elderly lives, the power dynamics that shifted when bodies failed and minds dimmed. By the time Margot turned 65, I was a specialist in dementia care. I knew the early signs, the progression, the legal frameworks that governed guardianship and medical decisions. I knew that Margot had no children of her own, she'd sterilized herself after adopting me, the ultimate control over reproduction. I knew she had no family, she'd alienated her siblings decades ago over inheritance disputes. I knew she had no friends, she'd never cultivated relationships that didn't serve her interests. And I knew, with the certainty that comes from long observation, that she was beginning to decline. The first sign was a forgotten appointment. Margot had always been meticulous about schedules, the planner, the reminders, the color-coded system that managed her social calendar. She missed a dental appointment, blamed the office, rescheduled. Then another. Then a charity event where she arrived on the wrong day, dressed for a gala that had happened the week before. I heard about these incidents from her housekeeper, a woman I'd contacted years ago and maintained as a source. Not spying, exactly, just information, just awareness of the enemy's position. The second sign was repetition. Margot telling the same story 3 times in a single phone call, not noticing my responses, not registering that she'd already said this. The third sign was confusion about money, unable to balance her checkbook, unable to remember which bills she'd paid, unable to explain where significant sums had gone. I waited. Let the decline progress, let her become aware of her own fragility, let her feel the terror of a woman who'd built her life on control and was now losing it. I waited until she called me, the first time in years that she'd initiated contact without a holiday obligation. "Elena," she said, her voice carrying something I'd never heard before, fear, genuine fear, emotion she'd always managed or denied. "I need to talk to you, about my situation, about the future." I drove to her house, the house that had been my mother's that Margot had transformed, that I entered now as a professional rather than a daughter. She was smaller than I remembered, the blonde now white, the efficiency cracked by anxiety. She'd lost weight, lost the polished presentation that had always been her armor. "I'm having some memory issues," she said, not looking at me, focusing on the coffee cup in her hands. "The doctors say it's early dementia, probably Alzheimer's. They say I'll need help eventually. Care, someone to manage things." "Yes," I said, my voice neutral, professional, the nurse rather than the daughter. "That's typically how it progresses." "I don't have anyone," she said, the admission painful, the words forced out by necessity rather than intimacy. "No family, no one I can trust. I hoped that you might consider." helping. In some capacity. I considered. Let the silence stretch, let her feel the weight of asking, let her understand that she was now dependent on the child she'd spent decades ignoring. I said finally. But I need to be clear about what that means. Not occasional visits, not phone calls. If I become involved in your care, it will be complete. Legal guardianship, medical power of attorney, control of your finances, your living situation, your medical decisions. You would be placing yourself entirely in my hands. She looked at me then, really looked, the assessing gaze that had evaluated my value at 9 years old now evaluating her own. That's a lot of power, she said. Yes, I agreed. It is, but it's the only way I can ensure you receive proper care. The state system is overburdened. You'd become a ward assigned to strangers, moved to facilities that meet minimum standards, or you can choose me, your daughter. Legally, the one you adopted. She heard the emphasis, the reminder of what she'd done, the transaction she'd completed to secure her position. I saw her process it, calculate the odds, assess whether this was a trap she was walking into. Why would you do this? She asked. After everything, after what happened. I set down my coffee, leaned forward, met her eyes with the directness she'd always avoided. Because I can. Because I spent 20 years learning how to care for people in exactly your situation. Because I paused, the truth arriving as I spoke it. Because I need to know that I'm capable of giving what I never received. That your absence didn't damage me permanently. That I can be present, even for you, even now, when there's nothing you can give me in return. She didn't understand. I could see that, the confusion in her eyes, the inability to process generosity without transaction. But she nodded slowly, the gesture of someone who had run out of options and was accepting the only path remaining. All right, she said. I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers. Already done, I said, pulling documents from my bag, the preparation that would have frightened her if she'd been capable of fearing me. I had them prepared when I heard about your diagnosis. You can review them with your attorney, but the terms are non-negotiable. Complete guardianship, complete control, or the state takes over and I walk away. She signed a week later. Not happily, not gratefully, but with the resignation of someone who'd spent a lifetime accumulating power and was now recognizing that power's limits. Moving Margot into my home took 3 days. Not the physical transfer, that was simple, a few suitcases of possessions she'd accumulated, most of which I discarded as unnecessary. The psychological transfer, the establishment of new patterns, the demonstration that her world had fundamentally changed. I chose the room carefully. Not the largest, not the nicest, but the one with the best light for the portrait I'd hung on the wall opposite her bed. My mother's portrait, painted when she was 30, the year before her diagnosis, when she was still healthy and hopeful and unaware of what was coming. The artist had captured her eyes, dark, warm, the exact color of mine, and her smile, the unguarded expression I'd never seen on Margot's face. Margot noticed it immediately. Who is that? She asked, standing in the doorway of her new room, her confusion genuine, the dementia already stealing memories she'd spent decades suppressing. That's my mother, I said. Your predecessor, the woman whose place you took. She looked at me, something flickering in her clouded eyes. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. I don't remember. You don't need to remember, I said, guiding her to the chair by the window, my mother's chair, the one Margot had discarded to the basement and I'd recovered and roof-ulstered. You just need to see her. Every morning when you wake up, every evening before you sleep, she'll be here, watching. The way I watched you all those years from the spaces you didn't notice. I established routines, medication at specific times, meals with specific nutritional requirements, activities designed to slow cognitive decline, puzzles, music, walks in the garden I'd planted with my mother's favorite flowers. I performed these routines with the professionalism that had defined my career, but also with something else, something I hadn't expected. Presence. Real presence, not the performance of care that Margot had always given me. When I fed her, I looked at her. When I bathed her, I spoke to her. Not about schedules or gratitude, but about the day, the weather, small observations that required no response. When she had moments of clarity, rare growing rarer, I listened to whatever she wanted to say, even when it was repetition, even when it was complaint, even when it was the old claim of motherhood that she'd used as a weapon. I'm your mother, she'd say, her voice weaker now, the assertion requiring effort. You were my legal guardian. I'd correct, gently, the way I'd correct any confused patient. You adopted me, remember, to secure your inheritance, to replace my mother, to make me yours. Sometimes she'd nod, the memory surfacing through the fog. Other times she'd look at me with fear, the predator recognizing the predator, the understanding that our positions had reversed, and she was now the dependent, the vulnerable, the one whose fate rested in hands she'd never bothered to cultivate. My colleagues thought I was saintly. The nurses I worked with, the friends who knew fragments of my story, they praised my compassion, my forgiveness, my ability to care for the woman who'd made my childhood a study in absence. I didn't correct them. Didn't explain that forgiveness was not what moved me, that compassion was too warm a word for what I felt, that my care was a form of possession more complete than any adoption document. But I also didn't correct them because I was discovering something I hadn't expected. The care I gave Margot, the physical labor of feeding, bathing, changing, the emotional labor of presence, patience, attention was changing me. Not making me kinder exactly. Not making me forgive. But making me capable. Capable of giving without receiving, of working without reward, of being present for someone who had never been present for me. It was not satisfaction, not the revenge I'd imagined, the cold pleasure of watching my enemy decline. It was something more complicated, more human, more like the peace that comes from finally understanding your own capacity. Margot's decline accelerated after the first year. The dementia that had been early became moderate, then severe. She lost language, lost recognition, lost the ability to control her body. I hired help, a nurse's aide during days, someone to assist with the physical labor that was becoming beyond my strength alone. But I remained the primary caregiver, the one who made decisions, who held power of attorney, who controlled every aspect of her existence. She didn't know my name most days, didn't know her own. But some part of her, deep in the wreckage of her mind, still recognized my mother's portrait, still looked at it with something that might be guilt, might be fear, might be the dawning understanding that the woman she'd tried to erase had outlasted her after all. I found her one morning, sitting in her chair, staring at the portrait, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't speak, couldn't explain, but her body was expressing something that language had never allowed her to express. Grief, maybe, or the terror of a life measured by acquisition rather than connection. I sat with her, held her hand, the way I'd hold any patient's hand, the way no one had ever held mine when I was 9 and watching my mother's photographs disappear. We sat together, the tears drying on her face, the silence between us containing everything we'd never said. That night I took out my hidden photographs. The 3 I'd rescued from the trash, now wrinkled and stained but still intact. I added them to the wall beside my mother's portrait, creating a gallery of the life Margot had tried to erase. My mother holding me, my mother at the beach, my mother alive, present, real in ways that Margot had never been. Margot looked at them the next morning, looked at me, and for a moment, just a moment before the fog closed in again, I saw something in her eyes that I'd never seen before. Not recognition, not remorse, just seeing. The simple act of looking at another person and acknowledging their existence. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. The second year was harder. Margot's body failed along with her mind, infections, falls, the accumulated damage of aging that no amount of care could prevent. I managed it all, coordinated with doctors, made decisions about treatments, held her hand through procedures that frightened her even when she didn't understand what they were. I told myself this was professional, that I was applying my training, my expertise, my accumulated knowledge of geriatric care. But there were moments, late at night, when she was sleeping and I was reviewing her chart, when the house was quiet and the portrait seemed to watch, that I felt something else. Something that might have been grief, if grief could exist without love. Something that might have been duty, if duty could exist without obligation. Maybe it was simply the recognition that I was doing this, that the child who'd hidden photographs between her mattress and box spring had grown into the adult who held her stepmother's hand while she died. That the transaction Margot had initiated with her adoption was being completed with my guardianship, the circle closing in a way neither of us had anticipated. My mother's pearls were in my jewelry box, recovered from Margot's possessions after she'd stopped wearing them, unable to remember why they mattered. I didn't wear them, didn't need to. Their presence was enough, the evidence that some things survive despite attempts to discard them, that memory persists even when the rememberer is gone. Margot died on a Tuesday morning in her chair, looking at my mother's portrait. The aide found her, called me, and I came home from the hospital to perform the final duties, calling the funeral home, arranging the cremation, beginning the process of ending a life that had intersected with mine for 40 years. I didn't cry, not then. But 3 days later, organizing her possessions, I found something I hadn't expected. A photograph hidden in her own hiding place, inside a book, a novel she'd never read, pressed between pages that had never been opened. It was of me. Not the professional adult, the nurse, the guardian, the child. 9 years old, standing in the kitchen, watching her sort photographs. The expression on my face, the confusion, the hurt, the attempt to understand what was happening, captured with a clarity that suggested Margot had looked at this image more than once. On the back, in her handwriting, the word Elena. Just my name. No grateful, no daughter, no claim of ownership. Just the name, the identification, the acknowledgement that I had existed in her world even when she tried to look through me. I held that photograph for a long time. Then I added it to my wall, beside my mother's images, creating a complete gallery. The mother who'd given me life, the stepmother who'd given me law, and the woman I'd become, standing between them, capable of care without forgiveness, of presence without love, of choosing to be the person neither of them had been able to imagine. The funeral was small. Not because Margot had no acquaintances, but because I'd controlled the guest list, limiting it to people who'd known her rather than people who'd performed knowing her. A few colleagues from my father's practice, now retired. A couple from the country club who remembered her from better days. No family, she'd burned those bridges too thoroughly for repair. I spoke. Not a eulogy exactly. A statement of facts, delivered with the professionalism that had carried me through her care. Margot was my legal guardian from age 10, I said. She adopted me to secure her position, and she spent 20 years maintaining that position through absence rather than presence. She was not cruel, she was simply not there. And I spent 40 years learning to be present, partly in reaction to her absence, partly because presence is the only inheritance that matters. I paused, looking at the small gathering, the faces that had known Margot as a social figure rather than a person. I cared for her at the end, not because she deserved it, because I chose to, because the only way to erase a legacy is to replace it with something better. And because I stopped, the truth arriving as it always did, in the speaking rather than the planning, because I needed to know that I could give what I never received, that her absence hadn't damaged me permanently, that I could be the parent she never was, even to her. I scattered her ashes in a garden that held no memory of her, no trace of her presence, no evidence that she'd ever existed, except in the legal documents that connected her to me. The garden was public, anonymous, a place where strangers walked and children played, and no one knew that the woman whose remains fed the flowers had once thrown away photographs of a mother and child. I kept the house. Not the one that had been my mother's, that I'd sold, unable to live in a space so loaded with memory and manipulation. But the smaller house where Margot had died, where I'd learned to care for someone who'd never cared for me, where I'd discovered capacities I hadn't known I possessed. I work there now, seeing patients through video consultation, managing the practice I'd built from the foundation of my nursing career. I have friends, real ones, who know fragments of my story and don't try to fix me. I have relationships, cautious, bounded, but present in ways that Margot never taught me and my mother never lived long enough to demonstrate. And I have the wall. My mother's photographs, my own childhood image, the gallery of women who shaped me through presence and absence. I look at it every morning, every evening, the ritual that grounds me in the truth of where I came from and the choice of where I'm going. I am Elena. I am 42. I was adopted by a woman who wanted my father's money, and I adopted her back when she needed someone to hold her hand while she died. I am not grateful. I am not forgiving. I am simply here, present, capable of care that requires no reciprocation, of love that requires no acknowledgement, of a life that belongs completely to me. That is my inheritance. Not the money, though I received that too, Margot's estate finally passing to me as her legal heir, the transaction completed. Not the house, though I live in it, transformed by my presence rather than hers. The inheritance is this, the knowledge that I can choose, that I can be the person my mother hoped for and my stepmother never imagined, that I can give what I never received, not because I'm noble, but because I'm free. See you in the next story.